There was enough excitement in the studio to break through steel. The lights were bright, and the cameras were moving. Two individuals sat opposite one another, waiting for the other to initiate contact, while millions of people watched on their screens. Before Karoline Leavitt reversed the situation with his words live on air, he thought he could spin the tale his way. Renowned Liberal reporter David Langford loosened his tie and leaned in a little. Karoline, there was an air of forced confidence in his voice that hinted at a plan. The American people deserve the truth, let's face it. This country has been repeatedly misled by Donald Trump. He asserted only last week that the economy was doing better than it had ever done under his leadership. But let's face it, under Biden. Karoline's face lit up with laughter. "I was waiting for this." She inhaled, letting the silence build just long enough to make the situation more tense, and then said, "Since unemployment is down and wages are up, isn't it time we stop pretending that Trump's policies were anything but disastrous?" In a calm but firm voice, but knowing that this moment might subsequently play out on social media under Trump, she moved slightly toward the camera. "But let's not rewrite history. You're standing here on national television telling the American people that things are better under Biden. Let's talk facts instead of feelings. Americans are having difficulty making ends meet in many states. Under Biden, inflation soared to over 9% at its highest point, whereas under Trump, it was less than 2%. Furthermore, David interrupted himself abruptly, deceiving Karoline. "We cannot deny that Trump played a role in the economic crisis that started when Biden entered office, and inflation is a worldwide issue." Just before Biden took office, in December 2020, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released this data, which indicates an inflation rate of 1. Instead of recoiling, Karoline reached for her notes and raised one sheet of paper. An economy with a 4% growth rate is stable and not headed for disaster. Now let's look at January 2022 under Biden's direction, 7.5%, and you want to let Americans know? David shifted in his chair and let out a breath through his nose, suggesting that the problem was with Trump's policies. Karoline saw the indications, albeit they were subtle. He tried to shift his attention and think of another angle, but she cut him off before he could finish. "Let's discuss unemployment since you mentioned it. The low unemployment rate is something the Biden administration likes to boast about. But they purposefully ignore the reality that under Trump 3, America's jobless rate was at its lowest level in half a century before the outbreak. When COVID struck, unemployment naturally increased, hitting a record of 5%. Even though this was a worldwide disaster rather than the product of bad policy, Trump oversaw the fastest economic recovery in history, and Biden assumed control of an already prosperous country." Karoline tilted her head and said, "You're twisting the narrative, and please keep in mind that Trump is facing multiple legal battles. Do you really think the American people should trust a man with so much controversy surrounding him?" David shook his head and laughed a little. He didn't fix anything, he just took credit for the rebound that was already happening. With a single click, a video clip began to play on the studio screen behind them, while she reached beneath the table and pulled out a little remote control. "David, it seems like she had been anticipating this moment. David, I have a question for you. How do you justify your constant accusations of Trump's lack of integrity?" David's face turned pale, but this was just the start. "If we're being fair, Trump's economic policies did raise wages and create a record number of jobs. You can't argue with the numbers, even if you don't like his manner." As the clip played behind them, David Langford's face stiffened as the irony struck like a freight train. The audio, which had been captured during an interview only months prior, was distinct and clearly his own voice. who had just painted Trump's presidency as a financial disaster, was now confronted with his comments, unquestionable proof that he had previously admitted the reverse. To give the issue the seriousness it deserved, Karoline let the silence linger. The audience in the studio and at home was already filling in the blanks, so she didn't need to speak yet. David opened his mouth a little and blinked, then he stifled a laugh. The audience could begin to question what else you conveniently forget when it fits your story if you can change facts that quickly. David's hands curled slightly on the desk. He was used to controlling the story and was a seasoned player in the media game. "You're misinterpreting that, Karoline. David said it just 8 months ago," and she leaned forward at a different moment. Rewriting history in real time and expecting people to ignore it is the problem with a lot of the mainstream media.
"But David, people do notice."
David forced a tight smile and shook his head when they noticed. But Karoline was aware that the power had shifted this time. In a resolute tone, she went on to say that the true problem was not that you had said it incorrectly in the past, but
rather that you were on TV today and pretended that you had never said it.
To be clear, Trump, like Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election and Stacey Abrams in Georgia, questioned the outcome of the 2020 election. Now let's discuss Trump's conduct if we want to discuss honesty. He is facing several indictments, incited turmoil, and refused to acknowledge the election results. Should we disregard all of that? Karoline let out a breath and cocked her head. Let's imagine for a second that Trump is as culpable as you want people to believe, even if political lawfare is nothing new. I have a list of suspected corruption, scandals concerning Biden's family. Are you willing to hold him to the same standard? It's protecting democracy when Republicans do it. It's a threat to democracy. David shifted once again as the studio crowd mumbled. Conveniently, you never bring up conspiracy theories. Karoline raised an eyebrow and said, "Oh, so now we're doing anything that makes my side look bad is a conspiracy theory routine? That's cute, but let's be real, David. This isn't about truth, it's about control. The media decides what's worth
covering." Everyone could tell David Langford was drowning.
Piece by piece, the confidence he had brought with him had been eroded until nothing was left but frustration. He was aware that he was being filmed, and he could identify every worried look and emotion. What's worth burying anyway? You're managing them, not telling them. Karoline wasn't going to back down, even though every misplaced breath would be examined online in a matter of minutes. She talked in a steady but firm voice, leaning slightly in. "David, let's try something simple. Did you say that Trump's economic policies created a record number of jobs?" After glaring at me, David answered, "Yes or no?" What specifically changed if it was the case 8 months ago? Did you simply decide they were no longer convenient, or did the facts just change on their own? David's expression deepened. He detested being forced into a corner. Karoline stared into his eyes, paused, and then let out a breath through his nostrils. "Yes," she responded, nodding. "But thank you." She passed a printed transcript across the table, pulled out a folder, and reached down. "Based on who was in office in 2019, you wrote that. This is a list of all the times you changed your position." A faint smirk played at the corner of Karoline's lips as she cocked her head slightly. "Oh, I agree that context does matter," she replied. "You said that earnings aren't keeping up with inflation and that unemployment numbers don't fully reflect the situation. David, you switched jobs because the person in charge changed, not because the economy changed." His fingers curled slightly, and his lips formed a narrow line. The economy is doing well, as seen by record low unemployment and rising salaries. In 2022, that occurred under Trump, beneath Biden. He glanced at the transcript and then back up at Karoline while the studio fell silent. He was aware that something he had written himself could not be denied. "You don't report the news," she added, her tone firm but abrasive. "You mold it, you influence people's opinions, and you distort facts when they contradict the story you're trying to sell." David's jaw tightened as he tried to gather his thoughts, but the damage was already done. He had been revealed as someone who had intentionally falsified material to support a story, in addition to being a person who had misspoken. Then the last hit came, and Karoline sank back in her chair, letting out a breath as though the whole thing had never happened. The crowd, which had been grumbling during the discussion, appeared to hold their breath as well. More than a small irritation, but what's truly wonderful, David, is that in spite of everything, you still won't admit that you were mistaken once. That's what this is all about, isn't it? Control and ensuring that people believe what you want them to believe, no matter how many times you have to alter the tale to do so, are more important than the truth. There was nothing more David Langford could do, no defense, no argument. In the ruins of the conversation, David Langford sat motionless, his lips pushed together, his often fluid rhetoric gone. Even though there was no longer any tension in the studio, he had nowhere to go and no pivot that could free him from the unavoidable weight of exposure. The fallout was just getting started, but the entire world was watching. After being abnormally quiet during the conversation, the moderator finally cleared his throat to restore control. He managed to giggle, but no one else chimed in, and it was certainly a heated argument. Karoline didn't need to gloat because the moment spoke for itself, and she knew that no clever talking point could reverse what had just transpired. Following David Langford's exposure, social media exploded. Videos of the conversation quickly went viral on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. The moment David realized he had no way out was the most damning. It was shown in slow motion with severe commentary
and replayed hundreds of times.
See the soul of this man depart from his body. People no longer trust the mainstream media because of this. David Langford was just handed to Karoline Leavitt, witnessed him choking on his words. The entire interview was available everywhere, so no amount of damage control could conceal the truth this time. Even traditional media outlets, which are usually protective of their struggles, tried to minimize the tragedy by claiming that Karoline had ambushed David or that the video was being taken out of context. Even a former producer from David's own show posted an enigmatic tweet that read, "Some people care more about narratives than they do about the truth." It was only a matter of time. Journalists who had previously backed him began to turn away, as one prominent political analyst from a rival network wrote, "This is why trust in the media is at an all-time low. We have to be better than this." The aftermath was deafening, and before it caught up to them, the walls were closing in on David's stillness. What could he say? That's why there was no social media post, damage control statement, or on-air explanation. Karoline wasn't done yet, but his own words had exposed him. The silence between David Langford and Karoline was broken by his usual aura of power as he sat rigidly in his chair. It was damning, not just awkward. He could sense it, as could the audience, and worst of all, the millions of viewers at home. Karoline knew when to move on and when to let the reality set in, so she maintained her composure and let the moment pass. Then she added David the last touch. Maybe this was a mistake, to be fair. She gave a slight shrug, but the issue is that errors usually seem to favor one side, and the truth always shifts according to the person in charge. That's advocacy, not journalism. David's mouth opened, but it was unclear if he was arguing or giving in. Karoline had not finished. You claim to care about democracy, but an informed populace is essential to democracy. After giving that some thought, she leaned forward and met his eyes. Tell me, David, would you ever admit when you're mistaken if you had the power to decide what the American people believe? Like so many in the media, what you're doing isn't informational. Rather, it's perception management. You only offer people enough information to influence their opinions in the direction you desire, not the entire story. Or would you just keep making up stories until they forget what was really going on? It was impossible to ignore the words as they lingered in the air like a keen blade. David wanted to reply, but what could he say? His face twitched. The moderator's remarks were regarded as crucial in the modern media landscape, and his reputation had been utterly ruined in front of the nation. Karoline desperately looked for a way out, knowing that the interview was far from over. She wasn't giving him that easy way out, so we'll have to stop there. As though this had all been a straightforward fact check, she interjected with ease, her tone lighter now. Her voice remained calm for the viewers at home as she turned to face the camera. At last, she relaxed, letting the moment unfold. As the interview came to a conclusion, David Langford sat there, ashamed and mute, but the impact had only just started. For this reason, critical narratives and independent thought are crucial. It's not just bias when the media decides to select facts to report, it's manipulation. While David Langford ripped off his headset, avoiding eye contact with Karoline, and muttered something under his breath, there was mayhem outside the studio. Karoline, on the other hand, stayed composed as she stood, brushed out her jacket, and shook hands with the moderator graciously in victory. Knowing that they had just witnessed a moment that would alter Karoline's career, the studio staff exchanged anxious glances. Karoline's phone was vibrating non-stop with notifications of news stories, trending tweets, reaction videos, hashtags, and hashtags by the time she got outside. Even networks that typically ignored Karoline were unable to remain silent about the tape Karoline Exposes Media, which had already garnered over 1 million views. Some even made an effort to downplay it. The most brutal indication that David Langford didn't tweet was the lack of a panel debate supporting him, a segment replaying the interview, and silence from his network. Although several sided with David and accused Karoline of acting in bad faith, the damage had already been done. The video was all over. Because truly, how does one heal from something like that? There was no formal declaration or effort to move past the humiliation. By the end of the week, media outlets began to speculate that Langford, who made his living by telling stories, may take a short leave of absence to give things time to calm down. People were sick of being told what to think only for the story, to change, sick of double standards, and sick of being used by the media. And even people who didn't always agree with Karoline couldn't deny what she had done. She wasn't only popular in the interim, she was booked, and additional networks contacted her for podcast invites and interviews, not because she had won a debate when it was convenient, but because it meant that people were actually asking questions. And in a world where narratives are controlled, asking the right questions is vital. Karoline smiled as she sat in her car, watching the headlines come in. Is the best course of action if you value facts over feelings and truth over fiction, and you don't just sit back and watch. Instead, stay informed, exercise critical thinking, and, above all, remain involved. Remember to like, subscribe, and press the notification bell. This is just the beginning.